All right, good morning, everybody. I appreciate you being on our broadcast this morning. We're going to talk some more about the State Construction Registry today. And last time we talked about the basics of the Utah State Construction Registry. So things like notices of commencement, filing preliminary notices, and things like that. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the other notices in the State Construction Registry so that as a user of the SCR, you'll be able to understand some of the other things that are going on in there. And then when I get done with this, if you have any questions about anything in the State Construction Registry that you're not familiar with, or that I talked about today, or that I've talked about before, I'll be happy to go ahead and answer those questions. And obviously, once we get through that, if you have any questions about liens or bonds or other collection issues, I'll be happy to take any questions on that as well. So, as most of you know, the State Construction Registry is pretty simple to get to. It's at scr.utah.gov, and when you type that in, it brings you to this page. So then once you get here, you just type in your username and password, and that'll log you into the State Construction Registry. The first thing that I want to talk about today is notices of retention. And notices of retention are a new notice in the State Construction Registry this year. Just went into effect on July 1st. And these are going to be a significant source of confusion for a lot of people. The reason that this is going to be a source of confusion for people is because people are going to think that the notice of retention has something to do with retention, that if retention has been held, that they would have an obligation to file it, or that if an owner holds retention, they have to file a notice they're holding it. Those are the types of things people will think it means. It means none of that. The notice of retention doesn't have anything to do with retention. It doesn't have anything to do with money being held at all. Instead, the notice of retention is a notice which designers file, so architects, engineers, surveyors, geotech folks, and stuff like that. People who are exclusively designed in the design process would file a notice of retention. And the reason that they would file a notice of retention is to establish what we call the priority date for their lien. So if I'm an architect and I'm designing a building, I've got lien rights. In fact, I have a special kind of lien right called pre-construction service lien rights. Also a new type of lien right that was just created as of August 1st of this year. And so one of the tricks that I've got if I'm involved in design as an architect or an engineer is that my work's all done in the office. And so up until July 1st of this year, the law in the state of Utah was that we would take the liens of contractors, architects, engineers, subs, suppliers, and so forth, and regardless of the date that those got filed, the law would treat them as though they were filed on the date of first visible work on the property. So that would be something along the lines of when an excavation's done, when footings have been dug, when rebar and footings are poured, things like that, something visible to show that work has started on the property. So if we saw that, then all the liens would be treated as though they were filed on that date. So as you can imagine, if you're an architect or an engineer and you do all of this design work, well, typically you're going to design the building or whatever the construction project is before there's going to be any actual construction work going on. I realize design build's an exception, but even there the design process begins first. So the problem that this created for architects and engineers and so forth is that they would have their work done, but their lien rights wouldn't really attach to the property until you actually had something visible going on. So in order to kind of fix that situation, the legislature carved out a new type of lien for those folks this year and call it a pre-construction service lien. And so those pre-construction service liens, instead of attaching to the property when visible construction work begins, they now attach to the property when the notice of retention is filed. So if I were an architect and I started designing a building today, then if I wanted to have lien rights for my design work, I would need to go in within 20 days of beginning my work and I would file a notice of retention here in the State Construction Registry. So I'd come over here, I would click on Notice of Retention, and I would fill out this information, which for those of you who have been using it as subs or as suppliers or as contractors, you'll notice that this screen looks basically identical to a preliminary notice, because a notice of retention is to pre-construction lien rights what a preliminary notice or pre-lien is to the lien rights of subcontractors and suppliers. So I would fill this out as an architect or an engineer who's doing the design, put in my information, and then I would file this, and I would have done two things by filing this notice of retention. Number one, I would have established that I have now acquired my pre-construction service lien right. So now I have lien rights on the property because I filed a notice of retention. The other thing is that I would have created the date that my lien will rank against loans and other claims against this property. So those are the two things that I get with my notice of commencement: my lien right and my date of priority of my lien if I file it. So don't get confused by notice of retention if you see one, and don't think that you need to do anything with the notice of retention if someone's holding money on you or anything like that. Unless you're involved in the design process, the notice of retention means absolutely nothing to you. Okay, before I go on, if any of you have any questions about notice of retention, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll click your mic, and I'll put you on so everybody can hear your question. Or you can also type me a question. But if nobody has any questions on notices of retention, then I'm going to move ahead to the next type of notice. Okay, let's talk about the next one then, which is this notice that we call an intent to complete, or the official name is a notice of intent to file a notice of completion, which is over here on the left side of your screen, lower left side of the menu for the notice filings. Intent to complete notices are also a very unique notice in the State Construction Registry. And most of the time when these get filed, they're actually not filed properly, or I should say they're not filed for the correct type of a project. The legislature a couple of years ago decided to create this notice, and it only applies to a very narrow scope of projects, which is a project that's privately owned, where the total value of construction exceeds $500,000, where the total time period for construction is more than 120 days, where the owner does not have a payment bond. Then the law says that the owner is required, or the general contractor, either one, is required to file a notice of intent to complete, and they have to file that 45 days before they file the notice of completion. So you can see that we're talking about a really narrow scope of projects that this notice of intent to complete applies to. It doesn't apply to any publicly owned projects, and it doesn't apply to residential projects, and it doesn't apply to any project that doesn't meet those other criteria. So anything that's less than $500,000, anything that's built in less than 120 days, or any private non-residential project where they actually get a payment bond. So it's a really narrow scope of projects. But when this is filed, and assuming it's filed on a project that it really applies to, then that puts an obligation on subcontractors and suppliers. And that obligation to the subs and to the suppliers is to come in and file this other document, which is called a remaining to complete. So let's just kind of walk through the process here. Let's say that I'm the owner of a large commercial project. So it's privately owned, it's non-residential, the value of the project is greater than $500,000, and it's going to take more than 120 days to build it. And I didn't get a payment bond to protect payment to the subs and suppliers on my project. So if those criteria are met, then within 45 days of finishing the project, either myself as the owner or my general contractor would go in and file the notice of intent to complete. So then that's going to get emailed out to everybody who filed a preliminary notice. Remember, when you file your preliminary notice, you have to include a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3 email addresses. So this notice of intent to complete is going to come out to all the subs and suppliers who have done a preliminary notice on this project. At that point, if you're a sub or you're a supplier and you look in your email and you see a notice of intent to complete, then that should put up a little red flag in your mind which says, okay, I have received a notice of intent to complete for this construction project. This is what it means to you. It means you've got 20 days to do your remaining to complete. The remaining to complete is an estimate of a good faith estimate of the amount of money that you are owed to complete the construction project. So you would come in here and you would see that you would in your inbox the intent to complete. So you would click on remaining to complete, and then you would fill out the information. In fact, if you wanted to, you could go in and you could, before even doing your estimate, you could get the SCR number for the intent to complete, and you could type that in, and then you could file your remaining to complete right off of that, so that would incorporate all of the information. The other thing that you can do is you can go into your own preliminary notice for this project. So you would look up your own preliminary notice and file off of that. And then that way you would have that information incorporated in there. So then you come down to the bottom, and what you have to do, as you can see here at the bottom of the page, this is where you give your estimate. So whether you launch this independent of any other notices, or if you launch it off of the intent to complete or your preliminary notice, you put all your content information, which is all of the stuff that's in your preliminary notice already, and then you come to the bottom, and it says right here, amount remaining to complete. And it gives you a little bit of information here on what you want to do. Now, the thing that I always tell subs and suppliers, because that's who has to file these, not generals, just subs and suppliers. The thing that I always tell you in these situations is this: never under any circumstances use this bottom one right here. Because this, you'll notice it says I owe. I, meaning you, the notice filer, owe to whoever you select from this list some money. So if you use this bottom one, so if you came in here and you clicked on that, and then you type in some person's name and you put in an amount, you've essentially admitted that you owe a back charge on this project. Remember on the TV shows, when someone gets arrested, they say anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. That's exactly the same case here. So if you fill out this bottom one and say you owe somebody some money on this one, and we're not talking about your suppliers, we're not talking about your subcontractors, we're talking about whether you're owed money on this project or whether you've been overpaid on the project. So this doesn't deal with anybody who's working underneath you. This is just you. So if you're still owed some money, then you click on this first one, and that says I am owed, and then you put in the name. So if you are working for the general contractor, you put in the name of the general contractor right here and the amount that the general contractor owes you, whatever it may be. If you're a subcontractor working under another subcontractor, then you would put the name of that subcontractor in the name field and then the amount that you're owed. Now, one thing that I want you to keep in mind is this. The value that you're putting in here is a good faith estimate. The key is that this is an estimate. You should be as accurate as you can, but something to keep in mind, remember, is that you're filing this notice because someone has filed a notice of intent to complete on this project. And if they've done that properly, that means there's still 45 days left in this project. So if you're still doing work on this job, the estimate you're giving today is going to be different than what you may be owed tomorrow or next week or next month over the course of the 45 days between now and when this thing finishes. So All you're doing here is estimating. The thing that you want to be careful of is that you don't want to get locked into this number. Like I said, anything you say can and will be used against you, right? So I think the wise thing to do when you come in here and do this is after you've put in the name of the person who owes you the money, after you've given your good faith estimate of what you're owed, then you come over here to the next thing, and that's this box, and you click that box. And when you do that, it opens up this field down here called Dispute Notes. And by opening up the field that says Dispute Notes, you can go in and you can type in there something to the effect of, this is a good faith estimate for an exact payoff, please call, and then put your name and a phone number. The problem is, as you can see right now, that the Dispute Notes field has decided that it doesn't want to work. That occasionally happens. So you may have to relog in. Looks like today the SCR is not functioning correctly. But my instruction to all of my subcontractor and supplier folks in classes like this one is this. Never say that you owe any money to anyone. Identify the person who owes you money, if any. Put in a good faith estimate. Click the box so that the dispute notes come up. And then state in there, this is a good faith estimate for an exact payoff. Please call, and then put your name and put your phone number. Now, if you want instructions for doing what I've just shown you, you can go to the Lien Council website and you can download the lien guide or purchase the lien guide from our bookstore. And that walks you through step-by-step how to do all this stuff, and it has some language you can put in those dispute notes. So if you wanted to do that, then you can get an account with Lien Council, which is free. And then you could log in and go to the bookstore. And then right here, the Utah Lien and Bond Guide, $69. You can buy that, and that's got instructions to do everything I just taught you right there, including language to put in the dispute notes to protect yourself. All right, so then you click Continue, and you go ahead and you file your remaining to complete. So now you're good to go. One of the things that you're going to see happen is this. Remember, I told you that the intent to complete applies to a very, very narrow scope of projects. Again, privately owned, greater than $500,000, more than 120 days to build, non-residential, and where there is no payment bond in place. But in the 2 years that this has been in effect, we've seen a lot of these intents to complete come out on jobs that don't meet those criteria. They come out sometimes on public jobs. They come out sometimes on residential jobs and stuff like that. The key that I want everybody to remember, especially subs and suppliers who are on this call today, is this. If you receive an intent to complete, don't sit down and go through the criteria and say to yourself, okay, is this a privately owned $500,000, 120-day, non-residential, no payment bond project? Don't worry about that. Just go ahead. If you receive the intent to complete, and if it comes from the owner or the general contractor, just do a remaining to complete. That way you've complied. And that way you don't have to sit there and wonder and try and have to turn yourself into an amateur lawyer. Just know if you receive an intent to complete, that the best thing to do is go ahead and file a remaining to complete. And then you're covered. And remember, the remaining to complete is due within 20 days after the intent to complete has been filed. Now, obviously, if you ever find yourself with some confusion on that, this webinar today is going to be on the Lien Council website in the Learning Center, so you can go back and watch it. I've also got a video in the Learning Center that just talks about remaining to complete, and also another one just on intents to complete. You can watch those if you need some clarification. The other thing that you can do is you can call and ask questions on the toll-free number. So I've kind of walked you through what you need to do, and then there's some resources on the website. And if you find yourself with some confusion on one of these things, just give us a buzz and we'll be able to answer the question for you and help you through it so that you know what to do and that you're confident that you've done the right thing. Okay, now another thing that I want to point out on intent to complete and remaining to complete is some other rules that apply to that, which don't specifically involve filing in the State Construction Registry. For those of you who are kind of new at this stuff, and by this stuff I mean lien and bond rights in Utah, Utah has a unique law which requires bonding on private projects. Most states do not require private construction projects to have a bond, specifically a payment bond to ensure payment to subcontractors and to suppliers. But Utah does, and that requirement applies for non-residential projects that are over $50,000. And so that's why we have this intent to complete, and the remaining to complete is for owners who haven't got the bond to try and protect themselves. Because if they don't get a bond and you folks don't get paid, then you can sue the owner for not having a bond and ask the owner to pay you for your materials. So this system's there to protect the owner. Now it makes sense that if the owner can come into the State Construction Registry and file an intent to complete and require all subs and suppliers to disclose the remaining amount that they're owed, that subs and suppliers should be able to have some confidence or assurance that they are also, that there's money there to pay them. And so there's a procedure where subs and suppliers who, after they file their remaining to complete, can prepare a document called a request for adequate assurance. And then you can use that request to determine whether or not there's money to pay you. The weird thing about that rule is that you would think that you could send the request for adequate assurance to the owner and confirm that the owner has enough money to pay you. But the way that the law has been structured is that you send that request to your customer or to the contractor you're working for. So I think that's kind of flawed. I think that should be required to go to the owner. But I think if you wanted to, you could give it to the owner. You just can't force the owner to disclose the information. The other strange thing is that when you do the request for adequate assurance, the person has 10 days to tell you whether or not they have enough money to pay you what's left on your contract. If they don't tell you that, your enforcement is to take them to court and have the court order them to tell you that they have money or they don't have money to pay you. And if they don't, order them to get a loan or get a letter of credit or a bond or something like that. So that's all kind of weird. I don't counsel people to do that. I think it's a waste of money to take somebody to court to force them to tell you whether or not they have money. By the time you get to that, you're probably either going to be suing them for breach of contract and filing a lien and some other stuff anyway. So if you want to, after you file a remaining to complete, you can send a request for adequate assurance out. And if it were me, I'd send it to the owner. I'd send it certified mail, or if you want to, you can have the sheriff serve it. So if you want to just try and put a little bit of pressure on the owner to see if you can get him to disclose, that'd be great. The law doesn't let you force them to. You can only force the person who you have your contract with. But if you want to try and see if you can get some information out of the owner, I think it's worth doing. So that's intents to complete, remaining to complete, and request for adequate assurance. So does anybody have any questions about that? If you do, go ahead and click your hand raise, and we can go ahead and address those questions. And if not, then I'm going to move on with just a couple other things here, and then we'll open it up for general questions. Okay. The next thing that I want to talk about is the notice of construction loan. The notice of construction loan, which I touched on a little bit in our last session, is another type of new notice that went into effect on August 1st of 2011. And the purpose of the notice of construction loan is to get information into the State Construction Registry about the property and about the lender. Remember, on your preliminary notices now, your pre-liens, you have to include the property tax ID number. And that can be a little bit tricky to find sometimes. So the idea the legislature had was to require the construction lender to put notice about the construction loan in here, which would include the tax parcel ID number. So that's the whole purpose of the notice of construction loan. So what you would do is, I'm sure that those of you who are on construction projects on a regular basis, the banks like to put up signs and say that they're lending money on the project. And so if you saw that on there and you knew who the lender was, then what you could do is you could come into the advanced search and you would select the county where the property is located. So let's say it's in Utah County. And let's say the lender is the Bank of American Fork, because the Bank of American Fork does a lot of construction loans. And so you'd click that they're the filer, and you want to search their notices of construction loans, so you click off of all these other things. And we won't do a date restriction, we've just looked at the county. So that tells us that in Utah County there are 39 notices of construction loan filed. Now remember, these have only been going in since August 1st. Going forward, you may want to narrow the scope of this a little bit. So you may want to put in a date limitation or something like that so that you don't get a huge amount of results. And you can do that by putting some date restrictors right here. So anyway, you come in, you search that, and now what you can do is you can look down through this list. And if you find the construction loan for your project, so let's say it's this one right here, we've got the tax ID number. We've got Lot 3, Plat B, Hanks Estates with an address. We have an owner's name. And then you can click on the copy button and you can click preliminary notice, which is what you want to file. And it's going to pull in that information and pre-populate all these fields. And so then all you have to do is go in and go ahead and file your specific information about it. And that way you've been able to launch a preliminary notice off of a notice of construction loan. So that's the reason. That's what a notice of construction loan is, and that's why the notice of construction loan is in there. It's for you to be able to have information that it's been financed, and especially for you to be able to get a tax ID number for the project in order to have some confidence that you got the right project in there. Now, like I said last time, you always want to confirm the information, so you'd want to check the Utah County Recorder's Office. So I would copy this tax parcel ID number off of here, and I would cross-check that in the county recorder's office in Utah County like I showed you last time, and make sure you got the right one in there. So anyway, that's what a notice of construction loan is for. Now another notice that is required in the State Construction Registry is this notice of construction loan default, which is the bottom left notice right here. This notice doesn't do you a lot of good as far as information about filing or use it to file any of your stuff. The whole purpose for the notice of construction loan default is to let you know that the owner has defaulted on their loan. That's important, because if the construction loan goes into default and you haven't been paid, there's a pretty good chance that if that default goes all the way through to a foreclosure, your lien rights are going to get wiped out. There are some circumstances under which you can get ahead of it. So if you could show that, well, obviously if you're an architect and your notice of retention was filed before the bank's mortgage, you'd be ahead. If you're a contractor or a supplier and you can show that the very first pre-lien, not yours, but the first pre-lien on the project was filed before the bank got its mortgage in place, then that gets you ahead and you would not lose out on this default. So you're never really going to use a notice of construction loan default to file anything, but if you come to work one day, you check your email from the State Construction Registry and you see that there's been a construction loan default filed, that should put a red flag up in your mind. And what you should do is you should say, okay, this loan's in default, the owner is not paying the lender, and if you haven't been paid, then you know there's a significant risk that your lien, that you're not going to get paid because they're not paying the lender. If you've already liened it, that your lien could be impaired. If you haven't liened it, that you may or may not have quality lien rights on this. So my suggestion to you is, if there's ever a loan default that shows up in your email inbox from the State Construction Registry, you should contact an attorney if you haven't been paid yet, and you should evaluate very quickly what that default means to your lien rights on that project. So if you see it, know that it's a risk, you have lien rights at risk, and you need to talk to a qualified person to be able to understand what it's going to mean for you and what it's going to mean for your collection on that project. Okay, those are the main things that I wanted to talk about today. We're about halfway through the hour, which is usually the way I like to structure these, so I've got plenty of time for questions, although we haven't gone the full hour yet. So at this point, I've walked through everything that I wanted to talk about today. So if anybody has any questions about what I've discussed today, go ahead and do a hand raise or type the question into me. And if nobody has any questions about that, then, because I've not seen any hands that are going up yet, if you don't have any questions about what I've discussed today, but you've got questions about the State Construction Registry, you can raise your hands on that too. Or if you have any other questions in general, we got a fairly small group today. So if you have any questions about lien rights, bond rights, State Construction Registry, or even, collection issues, contract things, or problems that you got, if you want me to answer those, go ahead and raise your hand. So I'll just wait for a couple seconds here, see if we get any hand raises, and if not, then we'll just go ahead and conclude. Okay, nobody's raised their hand, and I haven't got any questions on the questions, so I'm assuming everybody's okay with what we've done. If that's the case, then I appreciate everybody who's been on the call today. I hope the information has been instructive. Like I said, this webinar is going to be up on our website here in the next day or so you can come back and watch it. The other thing that you can do is you can go to the Lien Council website, and on the Lien Council website, not only will you be able to watch this in the Learning Center, but you'll also be able to go through and watch the other instructional videos that we've got for the state of Utah. And you'll also be able to go in and purchase materials from the bookstore if you want that, along with the other stuff. If you want to file liens, or if you need to search parcel numbers in the search center or anything like that. Additionally, remember that we run the toll-free hotline, so we always have the hotline available for you to be able to call in and ask any questions about lien rights and bond rights in the 3 states where we do work, which are Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that toll-free number is on the right-hand side of the screen there, 877-593-5949. So I appreciate everybody's participation today, and look forward to having you on the next class. And for information about upcoming webinars, you can go to the Webinar Center on the Lien Council website, and it will have a list of all the upcoming webinars that we're going to be sponsoring. We'll have them every looks like we got one every Tuesday through the end of the year, so you can go ahead and click on those and find out what's going on. Looks like our next one will be on December 6th, 10 o'clock. We're going to talk about Utah bond law, which I touched on briefly here today. So if that's of interest to you, we'll see you then. If not, we look forward to having you in on a class in the future. Thanks.